The recruits thought it was a joke. They saw the quiet logistics specialist, a woman too small and too silent for a place like Fort Cinder, and saw a target. The belt she wore, a simple strip of worn leather, not the standard-issue nylon web, was the focus of their ridicule. When one of them, a swaggering private named Jensen, used his multi-tool to snip it clean in half, the pieces falling to the dusty ground were a punchline. They waited for tears or a panicked retreat to the colonel's office. Instead, she knelt, picked up the two halves of her ruined belt, and walked away without a word, leaving their laughter to die in the oppressive desert heat. They didn't know that in taking her down, they had only shown her the first move. The response would come later, barehanded. Part 1. Arrival and Introduction. Fort Cinder was a place where the world ended and the military's real work began. It was scraped out of the Mojave Desert, a sprawling collection of sand-colored buildings that baked under a relentless sun. The wind was a constant presence, carrying grit that sandblasted paint and spirits with equal indifference. It was a proving ground, a place designed to break down the individual and forge a soldier. Into this crucible walked Specialist Anya Volkov. Her arrival was unremarkable. She stepped off the transport shuttle, a single duffel bag slung over her shoulder, her frame looking slight against the vast, unforgiving landscape. Her uniform was crisp but seemed a size too large, and her dark hair was pulled back in a severe regulation bun. She carried no presence, projected no authority. She was assigned to the S4 Logistics Depot, a glorified warehouse of spare parts, ammunition crates, and ration packs. To the hardened drill instructors and the cocky recruits of Bravo Company, she was just another paper pusher, a REMF, rear echelon motherfucker, shuffled off to a forgotten outpost to finish a forgettable career. She spoke little, moving through her duties with a quiet efficiency that went unnoticed because it was so seamless. She organized inventory manifests, tracked shipment waybills, and ensured the endless flow of supplies met the base's demanding operational tempo. Her movements were economical, her workspace immaculate. There were no personal photos, no trinkets, just a stark, disciplined order. The only thing that marked her as an individual was the belt she wore. It was dark brown leather, cracked with age and softened by years of use. Its brass buckle was scuffed and devoid of shine. It stood in stark contrast to the tactical nylon belts everyone else wore. It was a relic, a piece of a former life she'd carried into this new one. To the recruits, it was a symbol of weakness, of someone who didn't belong. The confrontation happened a week after her arrival. She was crossing the dusty expanse between the supply depot and the mess hall. A group of recruits, fresh from a grueling session on the obstacle course and high on their own testosterone, blocked her path. At their center was Private Jensen, a thick-necked farm boy with arrogance that outstripped his rank. "Well, look what we have here," Jensen drawled, a smirk playing on his lips. "It's the supply clerk." Anya stopped. She didn't respond, her gaze level, her expression unreadable. Her stillness seemed to irritate him. "What's with the old-timer belt, Specialist?" Another recruit chimed in. "You lose your G, I won." Anya's eyes remained on Jensen. She said nothing. Her silence was a vacuum, and Jensen, eager to fill it with his own importance, stepped closer. He gestured to her waist. "That thing looks like it's about to fall apart. Let me help you with that." Before she could react, or, more accurately, before she chose to react, Jensen flicked open the pliers on his Gerber multi-tool. With a quick, deliberate motion, he grabbed the belt, positioned the wire cutter portion of the tool over the leather, and squeezed. There was a sharp snap. The worn leather parted. The two halves of her belt fell to the ground, landing in the pale dust at her feet. Laughter erupted from the recruits. It was a cruel, barking sound. They expected a reaction. Anger, fear, humiliation. They received none of it. Anya Volkov looked down at the severed pieces of leather. Her expression didn't change, but something deep in her eyes, a flicker of cold, hard light, momentarily surfaced and then was gone. She bent down with fluid grace, picked up both pieces, and held them in one hand. Then she looked back at Jensen, her gaze so empty of emotion it was more unnerving than any threat. Without a single word, she turned and continued on her way to the mess hall, leaving the recruits standing in a sudden, uncomfortable silence, their laughter feeling hollow and foolish in the vast emptiness of the desert. 672 words. Part 2, Dismissal. Colonel Marcus Thorne ran Fort Cinder with an iron will and an unshakable belief in the system. His office was a testament to his career. Polished mahogany desk, flags standing at perfect attention in the corners, and walls adorned with commendations and photos of him with stern-faced generals. He despised disruptions, and Specialist Volkov, despite her silence, had become a disruption. He hadn't heard about the incident from her. She filed no report, made no complaint. The story came to him through the barracks grapevine, passed from a gossiping private to a concerned NCO who felt obligated to inform his platoon sergeant, who in turn informed the company commander, who finally delivered the sanitized version to Thorne's desk. An interpersonal conflict between recruits and a logistics specialist, the report read. Thorne read it with a scowl. He hated personnel issues. They were messy, inefficient, and distracted from the base's primary mission, turning civilians into soldiers. He summoned Specialist Volkov to his office. She arrived precisely at the appointed time, knocking once, a sharp, concise rap. "Enter," Thorne barked. Anya stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. She stood before his desk, perfectly at ease, her hands clasped loosely behind her back. She wore her standard uniform, her trousers held up now by a generic, standard-issue nylon belt. Thorne leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. He studied her for a long moment, taking in her small stature, her unassuming posture. He saw nothing impressive. "Specialist," he began, his voice laced with impatience. "I have a report here detailing an incident on the training grounds. An incident involving you and several recruits from Bravo Company." "Yes, sir," Anya replied. Her voice was calm, even. "The report is vague," Thorne continued, tapping a finger on the paper. "It says there was a confrontation. It says your personal property was damaged. It does not, however, say anything about your response, or lack thereof." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "So tell me, Specialist, why am I hearing that a group of raw recruits harassed a non-commissioned officer, and she did nothing? In my army, we don't tolerate insubordination, but we also don't tolerate weakness. Why didn't you put them in their place?" Anya's expression remained neutral. "There is nothing to be gained, Colonel. Nothing to be gained?" Thorne scoffed, his voice rising. "Discipline is to be gained. Respect is to be gained. You let them walk all over you, and you send a message to every recruit on this base that the support staff are soft targets." He picked up her personnel file, which he had requested earlier. He flipped it open, though he had already read it twice. "Specialist Anya Volkov, transferred from the Joint Special Operations Command Support Element at Fort Bragg. On paper, it sounds impressive, but I've made some calls. Your former unit was restructured. That's a polite word, Specialist. It's a word we use for units that are dissolved, for projects that fail. You were shuffled here to a logistics depot in the middle of nowhere. A lateral transfer with no promotion, no commendation. It looks to me like you're washed up." His words were designed to sting, to provoke a reaction, to see if there was any fire left in her. He got nothing. She stood as still as a statue. "You're a problem I don't have time for, Volkov," Thorne said, closing the file with a definitive thud. "This base is for training war fighters, not for babysitting clerks who can't handle a few loudmouth kids. Whatever happened to Bragg, whatever ghosts you're carrying, you will leave them behind. Your job here is to count bullets and boots. That's it. Do you understand me? Stay out of the recruit's way. Stay out of my way. Keep your head down and do your job. Am I clear?" "Crystal clear, Colonel," Anya said. There was no defiance in her tone, but no subservience either. It was a simple statement of fact. "Dismissed," Thorne snapped, waving a hand. Anya executed a perfect about-face and walked out, the door clicking shut behind her with the same quiet finality as her arrival. Thorne stared at the closed door, a feeling of deep dissatisfaction settling over him. He had expected to intimidate her, to assert his authority. Instead, he felt as if he had been speaking to a brick wall. He had dismissed her, but the unsettling feeling remained that it was he who had been truly measured and found wanting in that exchange. 711 words. Part 3. Observation. Life in the S4 depot returned to its monotonous rhythm, but Anya Volkov was no longer just counting inventory. She was studying. Her dismissal from Colonel Thorne's office had not been a reprimand. It had been a confirmation of her environment. She was underestimated, invisible, and in her world, invisibility was a weapon. During her designated breaks and in the quiet hours after her shift, she became a student of Fort Cinder. She didn't make it obvious. She would sit on a crate behind the depot, ostensibly reading a field manual, but her eyes would be tracing the movements of the recruit platoons on the distant drill square. From her vantage point, she saw everything. She watched Bravo Company during their hand-to-hand combat training. The instructor, Sergeant Reyes, was a powerhouse, all muscle and bellowed commands. He taught a curriculum based on brute force, wide, powerful strikes and aggressive takedowns. The recruits, especially Jensen and his clique, emulated him perfectly. They were strong, fast, and utterly predictable. They put all their weight into every punch, leaving themselves off balance. They charged head-on, telegraphing their every move. Anya cataloged their weaknesses: Jensen's reliance on a right haymaker, another's tendency to drop his guard after a successful block, a third's poor footwork. She mended her belt. In the stark quiet of her small barracks room, she laid the two pieces of leather end to end. Using a heavy-duty needle and wax thread from a standard-issue sewing kit, she began to stitch them back together. Her work was not delicate. It was functional, brutally strong. She used a saddle stitch, a technique that created two independent lines of interlocking thread, ensuring that if one stitch broke, the seam would not unravel. The result was a thick, raised scar across the brown leather. It was ugly, but it was strong. Stronger, perhaps, than it had been before. She threaded the mended belt through her belt loops the next morning. It was a quiet statement to herself. A thing could be broken and still be made whole, still serve its purpose. Her observation extended beyond the recruits. She learned the geography of the base as if it were a hostile territory to be infiltrated. She noted the patrol routes of the military police, the sweep patterns of the perimeter surveillance cameras, the exact moments of shift changes. She found the blind spots: the corner of the motor pool where two camera fields failed to overlap, the maintenance access tunnel behind the communications array whose grate was secured by two rusted, easily bypassed bolts. She learned the rhythm of the wind, how it gusted around the corner of the mess hall just before dawn, carrying sound and kicking up dust for cover. She was a ghost in the machine of the base. She fulfilled her duties perfectly. Her paperwork was flawless. Her supply requisitions were always ahead of schedule. She was a model clerk, but her mind was elsewhere, running threat assessments, calculating angles, mapping human behavior. Colonel Thorne had ordered her to keep her head down. He didn't realize that from down there, she could see the foundation of his entire operation and all its cracks. Sergeant Reyes would sometimes see her watching from a distance as he ran his drills. He'd shout, "Something you need, specialist." Anya would just shake her head and go back to her manifest clipboard. Reyes would snort and turn back to his recruits. "See that? That's what happens when you spend your life behind a desk. Don't be like that." The recruits would laugh. Anya would listen, and she would learn. Every insult, every dismissive glance was a piece of intelligence. They were showing her all their cards, completely unaware she was even in the game. 608 words. Part 4. Pressure. The Gauntlet. The name itself was a promise of pain. It was the final, capstone evaluation for Bravo Company's CQC training, a rite of passage at Fort Cinder. The structure was a maze of plywood and sheet metal built inside a cavernous hangar, designed to simulate the claustrophobic, unpredictable environment of urban combat. It was a labyrinth of tight corridors, blind corners, and small, interconnected rooms. The rules were simple: A four-man fire team would enter one end, and their objective was to neutralize the evaluator, a senior instructor role-playing as a hostile combatant, and reach the exit on the other side. Neutralize meant a successful, non-lethal takedown. Failure meant being killed by the evaluator's training pistol or being subdued yourself. The gauntlet wasn't just a test of technique. It was a test of nerve, teamwork, and the ability to function under extreme stress. The pressure on the recruits was immense. Rumors of past failures were whispered in the barracks. Teams that had been taken apart in seconds. Recruits who had frozen in fear. The sheer, brutal efficiency of the instructors. Sergeant Reyes, the lead evaluator, reveled in the reputation. "The gauntlet will find your weakness," he bellowed at the assembled company, his voice echoing in the hangar. "It will chew you up and spit you out. Only the best will pass. The rest of you will be back here, running it again and again until you get it right or you wash out." Jensen and his team were slated to go first. Their arrogance had solidified into a hard-edged confidence. They saw themselves as the best, the alphas of the platoon, and the gauntlet was their stage to prove it. They checked their training gear, blue dummy rifles, rubber knives, protective helmets with visors, with practice swagger. The day of the evaluation arrived hot and still. The air in the hangar was thick with the smell of sweat and nervous energy. The entire command staff, including Colonel Thorne, was present in the overhead control room, ready to watch the exercise on a bank of monitors fed by cameras placed throughout the maze. This was a critical milestone in the training cycle. Then disaster struck. As Sergeant Reyes was doing a final walkthrough of the course, demonstrating a takedown technique for a junior instructor, he landed awkwardly. A sharp crack echoed through the hangar, followed by Reyes's roar of pain. He collapsed, clutching his ankle. The base medics were there in minutes. The diagnosis was swift and brutal, a severe fracture and dislocation. Sergeant Reyes was out of commission for at least 2 months. Panic began to ripple through the command staff. Reyes was the only certified senior evaluator for the gauntlet on base. Postponing the evaluation would throw the entire training schedule into chaos, a logistical nightmare that would have repercussions for weeks. Colonel Thorne stood in the control room, his face a thunderous mask of fury. "What are my options?" he demanded of his executive officer, a harried-looking major. "Sir, we can't run it without a certified evaluator. We'd have to file for a postponement, get a replacement flown in from another base. It could take a week, maybe more." "Unacceptable," Thorne snarled, slamming his hand on the console. The recruits were prepped. The entire base was geared for this evaluation, and now it was all collapsing because of one misstep. He saw weeks of planning, resources, and momentum evaporating in the desert heat. The pressure in the control room was palpable. Down on the hangar floor, the recruits murmured among themselves, a mix of relief and disappointment. Jensen's team looked particularly frustrated, their moment of glory snatched away. The entire operation had ground to a halt. The system, so rigid and so dependent on its designated parts, had broken down. And in that moment of crisis, a quiet voice cut through the background chatter of the control room. It came from Thorne's aide, who was standing by the door, looking utterly bewildered. "Sir," the aide said, his voice barely a whisper, "Specialist Volkov is here. She says she can run the evaluation." 693 words. Par 5, intervention. Colonel Thorne spun around, his eyes blazing. "What did you say?" "Specialist Volkov, sir," the aide repeated, swallowing hard. "The logistics clerk. She says she's a certified Tier 1 close-quarters combat instructor and can serve as the evaluator." A humorless laugh escaped Thorne's lips. "A Tier 1 instructor? Counting spare parts in the S4 depot? Get her out of here. I don't have time for this nonsense." "Sir," the aide pressed, his desperation overriding his fear of the colonel's temper. "We have no other options. The entire schedule is collapsing. What if she's telling the truth?" Thorne paused. The logic, however insane it seemed, was undeniable. He was out of options. The choice was between certain failure, canceling the exercise, and a ridiculously improbable chance of success. He stared at the monitors showing the waiting recruits, the empty maze. His jaw tightened. Fine, he ground out. Send her in. But tell her this. If this is some kind of joke, if she embarrasses me or my command, I will personally see to it that her next assignment is counting snowflakes at a weather station in Antarctica. Down on the hangar floor, Anya Volkov was handed a set of evaluator's gear, a red training uniform to distinguish her from the recruits, a helmet, and a blue training pistol. She checked the pistol's action with an efficient practice motion, holstered it, and adjusted the helmet. She wore her own scarred leather belt, the thick, ugly seam of visible line across her waist. When she stepped into the briefing area, the recruits stared in stunned silence. Then a few snickers broke out. Jensen looked at his teammates and rolled his eyes in disbelief. This was their evaluator, the quiet little clerk they had humiliated. Anya ignored them. She walked to the entrance of the gauntlet, her footsteps making no sound on the concrete floor. She didn't give a motivational speech or a list of rules. She simply turned to face the 4 members of Jensen's team. The objective is unchanged, she said, her voice calm and clear, carrying easily through the cavernous space. Subdue the evaluator. Enter on my mark. She turned and disappeared into the shadowed maw of the maze. This is a joke, right? One of Jensen's team members muttered. Just means an easy pass. Jensen grinned, slapping his teammate on the shoulder. Let's go get our clerk. Inside the control room, Thorne watched the monitors, his arms crossed, his expression a mixture of skepticism and dread. He was ready for this to be a complete fiasco. Anya's voice came over the comms, devoid of any inflection. Begin. Jensen's team moved in, using a standard diamond formation. They were confident, moving quickly through the first corridor. They rounded the first corner, weapons up, scanning. The corridor was empty. They proceeded to the first 4-way intersection. Fan out. Check all corners, Jensen ordered, his voice crisp over their helmet comms. The first man peered around a corner to the right. He saw nothing. He took a step into the intersecting hallway. From the shadows above, a crossbeam he had failed to check, Anya dropped. She landed as silently as a cat, one hand chopping down on the back of his neck in a precise nerve strike. The recruit crumpled without a sound. She took his training rifle and melted back into the shadows before the others even realized he was gone. Status, Miller? Jensen asked. Silence. Miller, report. Panic began to set in. They tightened their formation, moving more cautiously. They entered a small, square room with 2 exits. As the last man stepped through the doorway, a hand snaked out from the darkness beside the frame, grabbed his rifle barrel, and yanked. The recruit was pulled off balance, stumbling forward. Anya used his own momentum, spinning him around and applying a chokehold that had him tapping out in seconds. 2 down. The remaining 2, Jensen and another private, now stood back-to-back in the center of the room, spinning in circles, their rifles pointed at shifting shadows. Where is she? The private hissed, his voice tight with fear. A sound, a faint scrape, came from the corridor ahead. Thinking she was in front of them, they both aimed their weapons that way. It was a feint. The sound had been Anya tossing a loose piece of gravel. She came from behind them, a blur of motion. She disarmed the second private with a stunningly fast wrist lock and a disabling strike to his shoulder. He howled in surprise more than pain as his rifle clattered to the floor. 3 down. Now it was just Jensen. He stood alone, his heart pounding in his chest, the arrogant smirk long gone, replaced by a mask of disbelief and primal fear. He was in a long, narrow hallway. The exit was visible at the far end, a rectangle of bright light. He saw a flicker of movement. It was her. She was standing there, waiting for him. Rage eclipsed his fear. He wasn't going to be beaten by a clerk. He roared and charged, lowering his shoulder like a bull, intending to smash her through the plywood wall. Anya didn't retreat. She stood her ground until the last possible second. As he lunged, she pivoted on the ball of her foot, a move of impossible grace. She didn't try to block his massive force. She redirected it. Her hand guided his shoulder, turning his forward momentum into a spiral. Jensen, caught in a force he couldn't comprehend, was spun around and sent crashing face-first into the very wall he'd intended for her. Dazed, he tried to push himself up, but she was already there. A precise knee strike to a pressure point in his thigh made his leg buckle. He collapsed onto the floor, disarmed and utterly defeated. She stood over him, her breathing steady, not even a flush on her cheeks. The entire engagement had taken less than 90 seconds. In the control room, there was absolute silence. Every instructor, every officer, and Colonel Thorne himself stared at the monitors, their mouths agape. They had just witnessed a masterclass in controlled violence, a display of efficiency and skill so far beyond their own curriculum that it was like watching a different species entirely. 892 words. Part 6, The Shift. The silence in the control room was a heavy, suffocating thing. It was broken only by the faint crackle of the open comms channel and the sound of Jensen's ragged breathing from the monitor. Colonel Thorne stood frozen, his eyes locked on the screen, displaying the overhead view of the final corridor. He watched the small, red-clad figure of Anya Volkov standing motionless over the last of the 4 subdued recruits. There was no celebration, no gloating. She simply retrieved the recruit's training rifle, placed it beside him, and then stood, waiting for the end exercise call. The 90 seconds of the gauntlet had fundamentally altered the reality of Fort Cinder. "My God," Major Evans, Thorne's XO, breathed, finally finding his voice. "Who is she?" Thorne didn't answer. He couldn't. The condescending words he had spoken to Volkov in his office echoed in his memory, each one now a source of deep, burning shame. "Washed up. Clerk. Stay out of my way." He had looked at a predator and seen a mouse. The sheer scale of his misjudgment was staggering. This wasn't just a competent soldier. This was something else. Her movements hadn't been about strength. They were about physics, leverage, and an almost supernatural understanding of the human body's weaknesses. She hadn't fought them. She had dismantled them. He keyed the microphone for the hangar-wide address system. His voice, when it came out, was rougher than he intended. "End exercise. Evaluator is victorious." Down on the floor, Anya heard the announcement. She gave a single, brief nod to the nearest camera, as if acknowledging the command, then turned and walked calmly toward the maze exit. The news spread through the base like a shockwave. The recruits who had been waiting for their turn in the gauntlet had heard the entire engagement over the comms and seen the aftermath as Jensen's team staggered out, their faces pale with shock and humiliation. The snickers and whispers about the supply clerk died instantly, replaced by a new kind of whisper, one of awe and fear. Jensen avoided eye contact with everyone. The man who had been the platoon's alpha just an hour ago now seemed smaller, his swagger completely gone. The prank with the belt was no longer a funny story. It was the memory of poking a sleeping tiger with a stick. He felt the phantom pressure of her knee on his thigh, the dizzying disorientation of his own momentum being used against him. He hadn't just been beaten, he had been taken apart with surgical precision. When Anya emerged from the hangar, she was met with a sea of silent, staring faces. She walked through the crowd of recruits, who parted for her as if she were a visiting general. She returned her evaluator gear to a stunned-looking NCO, who took it from her with a new, fumbling reverence. Thorne came down from the control room, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He approached her as she was about to head back to the S4 depot. "Specialist," he said, his voice flat. Anya stopped and turned to face him. "Colonel." Thorne searched for words. An apology felt inadequate. An interrogation felt inappropriate. That was an impressive demonstration, he finally managed to say. "I follow the exercise parameters, sir," she replied simply. "Your file says you were in a JSOC support element," Thorne stated, his mind racing to connect the dots. Support elements don't typically produce Tier 1 instructors. It wasn't a question, but the inquiry was clear. Anya's gaze held his. "My file is accurate, sir." Her answer was a brick wall, just like in his office. But now, Thorne understood it wasn't a wall of weakness or intransigence. It was a wall of absolute control. She was giving him nothing. He was the commander of this base, a full bird colonel, and he realized with a jolt that in this moment she held all the power. The shift in their dynamic was a palpable force in the air between them. The curiosity of the other instructors and officers was a buzzing, insistent pressure around them. They all wanted to know the same thing. Who was Anya Volkov? Thorne knew he couldn't let it go. This was more than just a talented soldier appearing out of nowhere. This was a mystery that had landed on his base, and it had security implications he couldn't ignore. The gauntlet had been a test for the recruits. Now, he needed a new test. One for her. 766 words. Part 7, the second test. Colonel Thorne's mind worked furiously. The gauntlet had revealed a skill set so advanced it was practically alien in this training environment. He needed to understand the scope of her abilities. He needed to see her limits. A standard evaluation wouldn't suffice. He needed something impossible, a scenario designed for failure, just to see how she would react when she was truly pushed. He devised the test that night, poring over base schematics and security protocols. It would be a red cell exercise, a simulated penetration test of the base's most secure facility, the Command Operations Center, or COC. The building housed the central command and control, the communications hub, and, not coincidentally, his own office. It was protected by cipher-locked doors, pressure plates, motion sensors, and a dedicated guard rotation from the base's military police detachment. The next morning, he summoned Anya to his office again. The atmosphere was profoundly different. The air of condescension was gone, replaced by a tense, formal curiosity. Specialist, Thorne began without preamble, gesturing to a large digital map of the base on a screen behind his desk. The COC was highlighted in red. I have a task for you. Anya stood silently, her posture unchanged from her last visit. But this time Thorne saw it not as unassuming, but as a state of coiled readiness. Tonight, at 2,200 hours, the base will be placed on full alert, he explained, his tone all business. A simulated active threat scenario. Your objective is to infiltrate the COC, access my personal terminal in this office, and retrieve a specific data file. The file is a dummy, codenamed Project Chimera. You are to download it onto this data stick. He slid a small, encrypted USB drive across his desk and exfiltrate without being detected. You're not authorized to engage any personnel physically. This is a stealth and infiltration exercise only. If you're detected, the test is over. He paused, letting the sheer difficulty of the task sink in. The entire MP detachment will be actively hunting for you. All security systems will be at their highest sensitivity. They will be told to expect a highly skilled intruder. You will have a 10-minute head start from the moment the alert is sounded. It was an impossible task. No one had successfully penetrated the COC during a full alert drill in the base's history. It was designed to fail. Thorne wasn't testing for success. He was testing for methodology. He wanted to see how she would approach an insurmountable problem. Anya looked from the map to the data stick, then back to the colonel. She gave a single, sharp nod. Understood, sir. Any questions, specialist? No, Kenneth. That night, at 2,150 hours, Anya stood in the shadow of the S4 warehouse, the encrypted data stick feeling cool in her palm. She wasn't wearing a tactical uniform, just her standard issue fatigues. She carried no specialized gear. She had only her observations and her mind. At precisely 2,200, the sirens across Fort Cinder began to wail, their piercing cry shattering the desert stillness. Floodlights snapped on, sweeping across the compound. The sound of patrol vehicles and running boots filled the air. The hunt had begun. From the control room inside the COC, now a hive of activity, Thorne watched the camera feeds, a knot of anticipation in his stomach. "Where is she?" he demanded of his security chief. "No visual yet, sir. She hasn't broken cover from the S4 sector." But Anya wasn't moving. She was waiting. She counted silently, tracking the initial, frantic response of the security teams. She knew that in any crisis, the first 5 minutes were chaos. Patrols followed their initial, pre-planned routes. Search patterns were predictable. She let the chaos mask her. After 6 minutes, she moved. She didn't run across open ground. She flowed from shadow to shadow, her path dictated by the blind spots she had mapped in her mind. She used the noise of a passing jeep to cover the sound of her slipping through a gap in a perimeter fence. She reached the communications array, her first objective. As she had noted weeks ago, the grate on the maintenance tunnel was secured by 2 rusted bolts. Using the edge of the data stick's metal casing as a makeshift screwdriver, she worked them loose. The grate came away with a soft groan. She slipped inside, pulling it shut behind her. She was now in the network of service tunnels that ran beneath the base, a dark, dusty world of pipes and conduits. It wasn't on any of the standard security schematics Thorne was watching. In the COC, the security chief was growing frustrated. 10 minutes are up, sir. Still no sign of her. It's like she vanished. Thorne stared at the screens, a cold feeling creeping up his spine. She wasn't failing. She was playing a different game entirely. 821 words. Part 8. The reveal. The service tunnels were cramped and dark, but Anya moved with a confidence born of memory and spatial awareness. She had mentally mapped this route days ago, estimating distances and turns based on the surface layout of the base. She navigated by the hum of generators and the distant vibrations of activity on the surface. To Thorne, watching his screens, she was a ghost. To Anya, she was simply taking the path of least resistance. She emerged from a ventilation shaft into a small, forgotten storage closet on the sublevel of the Command Operations Center itself. She had bypassed the entire perimeter of armed guards, motion sensors, and cameras. From there, it was a matter of patience. She waited, listening to the footsteps in the corridor outside, learning the rhythm of the internal patrol. When a gap appeared, she slipped out and moved up a stairwell, her soft-soled boots making no sound on the metal steps. She reached the command level. Colonel Thorne's office was at the end of the hall. 2 military police officers stood guard outside the door. There was no way past them, but Anya wasn't going through the door. Her target was the office adjacent to Thorne's, the Exos office, which was currently empty, its occupant in the command room. She had observed that the 2 offices shared a ventilation duct near the ceiling. Working in the shadows of the hallway, she used a paperclip she'd straightened to pick the simple lock on the Exos door. She was inside in seconds. A moment later, she was on his desk, silently removing the screws from the vent cover. She squeezed through the narrow duct, dust motes dancing in the dim emergency lighting. She dropped down into Colonel Thorne's office as silently as a falling leaf. The room was empty, lit only by the glow of the computer monitor. The alert was still blaring outside, a world away. She walked to his desk, inserted the USB drive, and located the dummy file, Project Chimera. The download was quick. Her objective was complete. But she didn't leave. She had another objective, one Thorne hadn't given her. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing the base's secure personnel network. She entered a string of alphanumeric characters, a clearance code so high it bypassed every security layer Thorne had in place. He had been trying to unseal her service record for days, hitting administrative firewalls at every turn. Anya unlocked it for him. She opened the file, leaving it displayed on the screen. Volkov, Anya. Specialist. S. N. Redacted. Last unit of assignment. Operational Detachment Sigma. ODS. Status. Redacted. Unit decommissioned under Directive 7 Alpha. Call sign Nyx. The name hung in the airless room. Nyx, the primordial goddess of the night, a figure of such power that even Zeus feared her. Below were mission summaries, almost entirely blacked out with redactions, but the visible fragments told a story of operations in places the world wasn't supposed to know about. Sabotage, unconventional warfare, high-value target extraction. And then, one final entry, a commendation from her former commander, a name Thorne recognized with a jolt, General Alistair Vance, a legend in the Spec Ops community. During the infiltration of the redacted facility, Operator Nyx was separated from her team, her primary equipment lost. Pursued by hostile forces, she neutralized 3 armed combatants using only an improvised flail fashioned from her leather-duty belt. Her actions under extreme duress directly resulted in the survival of her team and the success of the mission. Her belt, the scarred, stitched-together piece of leather. It wasn't a relic. It was a battle honor. The restructuring of her unit wasn't a failure. It was a ghost protocol. OD Sigma had been a unit so deep in the black, its existence so sensitive, that when it was finally dissolved for political reasons, its members were deliberately scattered into innocuous, low-profile roles. They were hidden in plain sight, their lethal skills buried under mountains of mundane paperwork, until they were needed again. Anya copied the Project Chimera file, removed the USB stick, and placed it in the center of Thorne's desk. She left her own file open on his screen. Then, as silently as she had arrived, she slipped back into the vent and was gone. 765 words. Part 9. Respect. In the command room, the tension had reached a breaking point. 30 minutes, sir, the security chief reported, sweat beading on his forehead. The alert is still active. No sign of her. It's not possible. Thorne felt a cold dread mix with a dawning, terrifying understanding. He had set an impossible task, and the silence was his answer. She hadn't failed. She had succeeded so perfectly that she had left no trace of her existence. My office, Thorne said suddenly. Lock it down. I want a 4-man team to breach it. Now, the security chief looked confused, but barked the orders. On the monitors, Thorne watched as 4 heavily armed MPs stacked up outside his office door. On his command, they slammed a ram into the door, splintering the frame, and poured in, weapons raised, sweeping the empty room. Clear, the team leader shouted over the comms. Office is empty and secure, sir. No sign of the target. Thorne was already moving, striding down the hallway toward his breached office. He pushed past the MPs and stopped dead in the doorway. The room was pristine, save for the splintered door. And on his desk, the small, black USB stick sat like a verdict. On his monitor, her file glowed, the call sign NYX seeming to burn into his retinas. He read the file, his blood running cold. Ot Sigma. Nix. The stories he'd heard in hushed tones at high-level briefings, the rumors of a phantom unit that went where no one else could, were not rumors. They were real, and he had one of them counting inventory on his base. The commendation about the belt hit him like a physical blow. The incident with the recruits, the prank, her silence. It all snapped into focus. It wasn't weakness. It was the infinite patience of a predator that knows it is surrounded by children. He picked up the USB stick. He turned and walked out of his office, through the command center, and out onto the main parade ground, which was now bathed in the harsh glare of the base's floodlights. The alert sirens were finally winding down, their dying wail leaving a ringing silence. Anya Volkov was standing there, in the center of the vast, empty square, waiting for him. She was just a solitary figure in the darkness, her posture relaxed. The command staff and the MPs from the breach team followed Thorne out, their curiosity drawing them like moths to a flame. From the barracks, recruits, including Jensen, emerged drawn by the commotion. They all watched as the colonel walked directly toward the quiet logistics specialist. He stopped a few feet in front of her. She looked at him, her expression as unreadable as ever. She held out her hand, expecting him to take the data stick. Thorne ignored the stick. He looked at her, at the woman he had dismissed, ridiculed, and underestimated from the moment she arrived. He saw not a clerk, but a warrior of a caliber he had never encountered. In that public space, in front of his officers, his security teams, and the very recruits who had wronged her, he knew that words were not enough. Colonel Marcus Thorne, a man known for his rigid pride and unbending authority, snapped his boots together. He raised his right hand to the brim of his patrol cap and delivered the sharpest, most profound salute of his entire 30-year career. It wasn't the perfunctory gesture of a superior to a subordinate. It was a salute of deep, unequivocal respect, an apology, a surrender. Anya held his gaze for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she raised her own hand and returned the salute, her movements as crisp and perfect as everything else she did. The silent gesture, under the cold desert stars, was a treaty signed between two worlds. 708 words. Part 10. Closure. The following morning, the atmosphere at Fort Cinder was irrevocably changed. The story of the colonel's salute on the parade ground had spread to every corner of the base. The whispers that followed Anya Volkov were no longer tinged with mockery, but with a palpable sense of awe and a healthy dose of fear. She was no longer the invisible clerk. She was a living legend, a ghost who had walked among them. The recruits of Bravo Company gave her a wide berth. They would fall silent when she passed, their eyes tracking her with a new, reverent understanding. They now saw the quietness not as meekness, but as a dangerous stillness. Her small frame no longer looked weak, but deceptively lethal. Later that day, as Anya was supervising the loading of a supply truck, Jensen approached her. He moved hesitantly, his usual bravado completely gone. He didn't try to speak. He knew no words could possibly suffice. Instead, he stopped a few feet away and placed an object on a nearby crate. It was a new belt made of thick, high-quality bridle leather with a heavy, solid brass buckle. It was a peace offering, a tribute. He looked at her, gave a short, respectful nod, and then backed away, disappearing as quickly as he had come. Anya looked at the new belt. It was pristine, strong, and unmarked by history. Then she looked down at her own belt, the one she had painstakingly stitched back together. She ran her thumb over the thick, raised scar of thread. The scar was not a mark of shame. It was a reminder, not of the recruit's insult, but of a dark night in a forgotten land, of survival against impossible odds, of a promise she had made to her team and to herself. It was a part of her story. She left the new belt sitting on the crate. It was a fine gift, a gesture she understood and quietly accepted, but it was not for her. Her own scarred, mended belt was more than just a tool to hold up her trousers. It was a testament to her resilience. A thing could be broken and put back together, and in the mending, it could become something more than it was before. That evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, painting the desert sky in hues of orange and purple, Anya walked toward the edge of the base. She stood for a moment, looking out at the vast, empty expanse. She was still Specialist Volkov, the logistics clerk. Her duties tomorrow would be the same as they were yesterday. She had sought no recognition, no change in her status. She required no one's validation. Colonel Thorne watched her from his office window. He had a new set of orders on his desk, direct from the Pentagon. They were transfer orders for him. He was being reassigned. A quiet voice at the other end of the secure line had explained that certain assets required a specific kind of discrete command environment, and that his actions, however well-intentioned, had compromised that. He was being moved, and a new CO, one who knew the truth of OD Sigma, was on his way. He wasn't being punished, but he was being removed from the equation. He had stumbled into a world far deeper and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. He watched Anya, a solitary figure silhouetted against the fading light. She was content in her anonymity, her quiet competence a self-contained force of nature. She had won her war at Fort Cinder without firing a shot, without raising her voice, without asking for anything. Her dignity, which she had carried from the very beginning, was now understood by all. The scarred belt around her waist was a quiet, powerful symbol of who she was. A woman who could be cut in half and still be whole, whose greatest strength lay in the very scar she bore. 765 words.